has called this an escalation and says he's long warned that Russian actions are not limited to Ukraine.
Firing missiles at NATO territory is a Russian attack on collective security. This is a very significant escalation. I want to say now to all our Polish brothers and sisters, Ukraine will always support you. Free people will not be broken by terror.
Jonah Howell joins us live from Kyiv, and Jonah, bring us right up to date with the very latest.
Well, you heard those words there from Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, responding to these reports that have been filtering through during the evening and have created quite a stir, of course, among European allies. In Europe, reports of 2 Russian missiles, possibly Russian missiles, going astray perhaps during the wave of attacks, an enormous wave of missile attacks across this country during the course of the afternoon, hitting energy infrastructure. 2 of them, it appears, falling on Polish soil and killing 2 people. President Zelensky essentially saying there, look, I've been warning about this sort of thing for months now, that this is not and never was a war that could be contained solely within Ukraine's borders, that the chance existed every day that it would spill over and envelop other countries and other territories, and so it has. He uses those words, collective security, as a signal, a trigger to NATO, that he wants NATO to respond. And indeed that message picked up by his foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, who said that collective response to Russia's actions must be tough and principled. It must begin immediately with a full meeting of NATO, including Ukraine, to discuss next steps, and specifically he wants those next steps to include much greater weaponry for air defense. They have, of course, received huge amounts of military equipment and aid, the Ukrainians, since the beginning of this war, but the one thing they feel they could do with more of is air defense equipment. They've got very sophisticated surface-to-air missiles. They were very effective during the course of this afternoon, shooting down some 70 of the 90 or more rockets and missiles that were fired, but they'd love planes. They'd love planes to be able to prosecute a no-fly zone here. He asked for F-15s and F-16s. And that's the one thing NATO has been most cautious about supplying, because logistically and technologically it requires close NATO support, and they don't want to be seen as coming into, or seen as being in direct conflict with Russia. Mr. Zelensky will calculate now that this is a moment of maximum opportunity to strengthen NATO's collective support for Ukraine and potentially go further and supply the weaponry, the air equipment, the jets and planes that he's been asking for since the beginning of the war.
And Jonah, in Poland, where this incident has happened, and they've lost 2 Polish citizens, we've had reaction from the Polish government, which has been talking to other governments around the world, including the US president. So talk us through what the Polish response is.
Well, the key thing is that it is what Poland decides to do next. I think Poland went straight into an Emergency Security Council meeting as this news emerged. And we haven't heard directly from the Polish government since. They've been negotiating or collating evidence and communicating closely with their allies. Read, I think, particularly the United States there, the most senior of the NATO allies, treading very carefully, very gingerly over what is a hugely sensitive moment, the possibility of Russian missiles fired onto NATO soil. Do they trigger that collective security? Article 5 of the founding NATO treaty has only happened once at 9/11. More likely, Article 4 comes into play. And we have heard from the spokesman of the Polish government suggesting the government is considering doing exactly that in consultation with its allies. What is NATO's Article 4? Well, it is when any member among the 30 decides that their independence, security or sovereignty are under threat. They can call a meeting of NATO to decide what has to happen next. There is no need for any action to be taken. A unanimous decision is required, but this looks to be the direction in which we're headed now, in the direction of formal consultations among NATO members, led by Poland, as to what should happen next.
Jonah Howell, thank you very much indeed. The US State Department says the reports out of Poland are incredibly concerning. It says it's working to determine what happened and appropriate next steps.
The United States is certainly not trying to escalate or incite the situation at all. And like I said, we have seen these same reports that you all have, and we are working with the Polish government to gather more information. And we are not at a point where we can confirm some of these reports that we are seeing. And that's why I'm telling you that we will determine what exactly has transpired, and we will determine appropriate next steps as well.
The White House says US President Joe Biden has been holding talks with his Polish counterpart. Rosalind Jordan joins us live from Washington, D.C., and I'm guessing it's probably a bit early to know the content of that call.
That's right. There is not yet a readout from White House officials on what Joe Biden discussed with Andrzej Duda, but the president, who is in Bali, was briefed on the incident and then had this conversation with his Polish counterpart. And it follows a phone call between the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, with his Polish counterpart. There are separate reports, which we have not yet confirmed, that the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, may be speaking as well with his Polish counterpart about this incident just a few kilometers from the border between Poland and Ukraine, which had been the target of a Russian missile shelling on Tuesday. Now, it's not clear whether there have been any offers by the U.S. government to assist Poland in its investigation of this incident. Certainly, the various branches of the U.S. government are very much aware of what has happened and what could possibly be the unintended consequences, which would be a ratcheting up of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and possibly drawing in some of their neighbors who happen to be members of NATO. Now, of course, as we have heard from Jonah Hull, there's this question of whether this was an intentional attack and whether it was carried out by Russia, two questions that have not been answered. There's also the question of whether this is something that simply means that countries near the borders of Russia and Ukraine need to be on a higher defense posture, as it were. But until there actual is evidence investigated, until the circumstances of what happened on Tuesday in that small village can actually be reconstructed, you're going to see a very deliberate, a very slow, a very cautious response from the U.S. government. From the very beginning, it has been very concerned about trying to see any sort of provocation of this conflict. We'll note that just on Monday in Ankara, Turkey, the CIA director, Bill Burns, was meeting with his Russian counterpart to deliver a message from Washington that he doesn't want to see Russia use nuclear weapons in its war with Ukraine. Certainly, if you have that kind of conversation happening between two senior intelligence officials, it stands to reason that the U.S. does not want to see any sort of military escalation, whether it involves conventional or nuclear weapons. Certainly, it does not want to see this war between two countries spread to a third.
Rosalind Jordan in Washington, thank you very much. In response, Russia's defense ministry is reported to have said statements by Polish media and officials about the Russian missiles hitting Polish territory are a deliberate provocation with the aim of escalating the situation. It went on to say no strikes against targets near the Ukrainian-Polish border have been carried out by Russian weapons. Poland, as we've mentioned, is a NATO member, and NATO allies from Estonia to Belgium have reacted strongly. The Lithuanian President, Gitanas Nausėda, wrote on Twitter, concerning news from Poland tonight on at least 2 explosions, keeping in close contact with our Polish friends. Lithuania stands in strong solidarity with Poland. Every inch of NATO territory must be defended. And there's been this reaction from the Latvian Foreign Minister, Edgar Rinkēvičs, tweeted that Russian missiles hitting the territory of the NATO member is a very dangerous escalation by the Kremlin. He added that Latvia expresses full solidarity with our ally Poland and will support any action deemed appropriate by Poland. Russia will bear full responsibility for all the consequences. Al Jazeera's Harry Fawcett has recently returned from Kyiv. He joins me live in the studio. So Harry, what's the situation right now? We've got this reports of missiles going off and a mixed reaction from different areas. Some people being cautious about what they're even saying, and others attributing the blame to Russia.
That's right. We don't yet know exactly what it was that hit Polish territory. I think it's important that we remember that. The Polish government spokesman gave a pretty terse statement, and he didn't answer questions as to exactly what happened. But what he did say was that Poland was putting on increased combat readiness, some units, increasing the readiness of units that are already in combat status as a result of this incident. And he also said that Poland was verifying whether to invoke Article 4 of the NATO treaty. Article 5, of course, is the article that mandates every member of the treaty to come to the aid of any country that belongs to NATO that is attacked. So Article 4 is one step short of that. If a country decides that it has had its territory threatened, its territorial integrity, its political independence, or its security, then it can call for a consultation of all the members of NATO, and Poland is saying that it is thinking about doing that.
And so there is a kind of there can be a graded response, can't there, in terms of how NATO reacts?
Absolutely. Even if Article 5 is invoked, that doesn't necessarily mean that military action will follow as a matter of course. It mandates that the collective self-defense of NATO can come into force, and that any means necessary, deemed necessary by the NATO members, including military force, can then be carried out. So if it is decided or evidence has found that it was a Russian cruise missile or two Russian cruise missiles that caused this explosion inside Poland, killing 2 people, then NATO has a number of options to choose from, which I think most analysts would argue that it would be unlikely to be a major military action and a further escalation, given that I think if it were such a evidence of a Russian attack, is it then deemed to be a deliberate Russian attack on NATO or perhaps a stray missile? And of course there is always the option and the possibility, and there are some people investigating this as we speak, as to whether it might have been an intercepted missile or a stray Ukrainian air defense missile. I think until that key fact is established, it's quite early in the process to talk about military or other responses coming from NATO.
Harry Fawcett, thank you very much. Well, French President Emmanuel Macron says Wednesday's G20 meeting will be an important moment to draw attention to the situation. Let's get some more European reaction from Natasha Butler in Paris. And Natasha, varying degrees of response, so talk us through the main ones.
Yes, indeed. I mean, you just mentioned there President Macron, who's at the G20 in Bali, really nearly on the other side of the world to where this incident took place in Poland. Also there, the head of the Council, Charles Michel, who has come out on Twitter and said that he is deeply shocked by the news. The head of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that she is alarmed. The Belgian Prime Minister strongly condemned the incident, and we've been seeing a lot of those kind of messages, particularly from Western European countries, who are, though, taking a cautious approach to what has happened. They are not pointing the finger at Russia or anyone else. They are all saying that they're closely monitoring the situation. Those are certainly the words of the German Foreign Minister a bit earlier, and waiting to see what comes out of Poland's investigations. The French President Emmanuel Macron says that it's absolutely necessary to verify what has happened with these explosions. So he's not even calling these missiles, and that shows you the sort of caution that is being exercised by many European leaders. It's not what we heard, though, from some East European leaders and politicians and officials a little bit earlier. I think you already mentioned the Latvian Foreign Minister talking about these being Russian missiles. Also, the Slovak Defense Minister saying that these are Russian missiles and that Russia had to explain what had happened. So mixed reactions, but there is no doubt a lot of anxiety in capitals across the European Union, of course, and across the capitals of NATO member states, because Poland is a NATO ally. It has been for many years, and there has been a real fear in Poland that missiles might come across the border. It was some weeks after the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and some missiles landed very close to the Polish border on the Ukrainian side. People in villages in Poland close to that border said that they could feel their windows rattle. They came so close. And other bordering countries to Ukraine also very concerned. We heard from Jens Stoltenberg as well, the head of NATO. He says that, of course, NATO members are in close consultations with Poland, and we understand that Poland has called a meeting on Wednesday of NATO ambassadors to discuss the situation, and there will, said one official, of course, be continuing investigation, but that could take some time.
Natasha Butler, thank you very much indeed. Well, here's where the missiles are reported to have landed, in the village of Przewodów, a village in southeastern Poland, not far from the border with Ukraine. It's about 100 kilometres north of the Ukrainian city of Lviv. Earlier, I spoke to Bartosz Beklarczyk, who's the editor-in-chief of Onet, a news outlet in Poland.
It happened in a countryside. It happened in a very small village, about 8-9 kilometers from the border of Ukraine, close to the city of Lviv. And on the other side of the border, there is a train station that is used by Ukrainian trains. And we think that the train station was the target of the missile attack by Russian military. And we don't know why the missiles went astray. We truly don't think that Poland was actually the target of the attack. But we do think that the missiles for some reason went astray and they crossed the border and fell in Poland. We think there were 2 missiles that went to Poland. And that's what we know for now. That's all we know for now. The area where it happened is actually closed. There are reporters from Onet and other media in Poland that are trying to get to the site. Our understanding is that they're meeting the military experts who went to the site of to the place where the event took place today, and they're listening to the military experts, and depending on what the experts tell them, depending on what really happened, because so far we don't know, depending on what happened, there will be a reaction from the Polish government. There will be a consultation with the NATO allies, with all the NATO member states. That's why you heard the Pentagon spokesperson telling us that they don't know what happened so far, because they're also waiting for the Polish government to establish what happened.
More for you just after this short break.